Introduction. The sound of energy humming and fans cutting against the stale air greeted Sig as he regained consciousness. He looked around and noticed he had awakened in a prison cell, and that the energy humming was primarily coming from the field that blocked his exit. He looked around for any other means of escaping the small enclosure, but was unable to find anything besides the metal slab bolted to the wall intended to act as a bed, and the small stained pot in the corner meant to be used as a toilet. There were no other fixtures that were visible, and even the light source was provided by flickering fluorescent bulbs in the room beyond the humming force field. Sig tried to ignore the throbbing pain in his temples as he looked around. Outside his cell, he was able to vaguely perceive an examination table, such as one a physician would use, that seemed to have plastic tubes and wires coming into it from the floor and ceiling. He could not be sure, but he suspected that someone was on top of the table and was attached to the various tubes and wires. A set of shelves holding a variety of tools, jars, and supplies was blocking direct view of the top of the table. The room outside seemed to be curved, and Sig realized that there were other cells on either side of him. "Anyone else here?" said Sig quietly. He reduced his breathing to focus on any sounds that he might hear in response. He paused for a moment, but was unable to hear anything. "Anyone else here?" said Sig a bit louder. He stopped and waited, hoping for some kind of answer. Suddenly a repetitive clanking and humming noise came from some place beyond his vision. He strained to see the source of this noise and to see whether it belonged to a potential friend or foe. Finally, the source of the sound made itself manifest. It was Zeta-28. Zeta-28 was an augment that had replaced most of her body with machines. There were cameras and sensors woven into her skull. Her legs had been replaced by a set of tank treads. Though she still had her natural arms, her spine had been reinforced and secured to the tank treads below. It was not the first time that Zeta-28 had encountered the Divine Key Guardians. As all other augments, she was obsessed with the augment philosophy, survival of the fittest. Improvement, or more accurately, perceived improvement, was as a religion to augments. The weakest of augments would weave tools into their arms, heads, and legs. Some of the surgeries ended up leaving the augments worse off than before, such as those that had their hands replaced with axes. Others had more advanced surgeries that allowed them to have increased sight, hearing, offense, or defense. The most powerful augments had adjusted themselves to maximize their dominance over others. Zeta-28 was not a slaver as many augments were. That is not to say that Zeta-28 was not a slave owner. She was. It was more that slavery was not her goal or livelihood. She was obsessed with increasing what she felt were the three most valuable attributes: speed, strength, and intelligence. She had acquired through cruel experimentation individuals that were extremely intelligent and that were quite strong. Consequently, she had invested heavily in an attempt to acquire Ulysses Lizard Carter, who was gifted with almost supernatural speed and who had become the bearer of the space key, allowing him to teleport. She had been thwarted by the combined efforts of the divine key bearers. Consequently, she took great pleasure in having captured Sig West. "Siegfried," said Zeta-28 with a smile. "It's Sig," corrected Sig. "Why would that be?" asked Zeta-28. "Your parents named you Siegfried West." Sig narrowed his eyes but did not speak. Finally, Zeta-28 continued. "You are just like Ulysses Carter, holding on to custom identifiers." "It's Lizard," corrected Sig. "Such an unusual group," said Zeta-28 as she rolled along her tank treads. "Although I cannot deny that you have been extremely valuable to the Master." "I did not think you would be capable of calling someone else Master," said Sig with air quotes. "So nicknames are not the only habit you acquired from Ulysses," said Zeta-28 in a fascinated tone. There was another awkward pause before the augment continued. I have calculated the possibilities. Assisting the Archdemon provides not only the means for survival, but allows me to freely pursue my own inquiries with the least amount of interference. It was a logical decision. Logical if you trust the word of an Archdemon, said Sig. I have calculated the odds that he is deceiving me, and they are quite low, said Zeta-28. Have you calculated that he's going to destroy the Earth? Asked Sig angrily. I don't believe you are fit enough to survive without it. Zeta-28 seemed offended by Sig's statement. He will not destroy the entire Earth, said Zeta-28, but even now, large portions of the Earth are not really capable of supporting life. His plan will not represent a loss of efficiency. In fact, humankind will all be tracked and farmed to supply his sacrificial needs and my scientific curiosities. You are despicable, said Sig angrily. Zeta-28 smiled again, as though Sig had paid her a compliment. Perhaps, said Zeta-28. A light turned on above the examination table to reveal Row 82 strapped to it. Dozens of tubes and wires had woven themselves into his flesh. He had a deathly look about him. Sig was determined not to show emotion, but he clenched his fists tightly. Row 82 was an augment who had dedicated himself to the destruction of the Divine Keys and their guardians until Lucas Flynn revealed that he himself had been chosen to bear the Perception Key. Though he had not abandoned all of his philosophies, over time he had become a trusted member of the 9 Divine Key bearers. Your companion here has been quite useful, said Zeta-28. His ability to perceive has augmented the security of this structure by 243%. Attempts like yours to rescue him or that lovely engineer girl are even less likely to succeed now. The lovely engineer girl to which Zeta-28 referred was Stephanie Mason. She had been a slave in an augment farm and had been rescued by Sig's team, primarily with the brilliant strategies of young Lucas Flynn, the guardian of the Key of Origins. Stephanie was not only a skilled engineer, but the bearer of the Key of Prophecy. You speak as though you are the puppeteer, but you are the one being manipulated, said Sig. Hardly, said Zeta-28. The Master did not trust William Fine, so he had me do a little surgery to ensure that his consciousness or his personal ambitions would not interfere with the Master's plans. You lobotomized him? Asked Sig with a gasp. You make it sound crude, said Zeta-28. It was actually a complicated procedure, and precision was required to disable the correct portions of his brain. You're still being manipulated, just by the Archdemon directly, said Sig. If what you say is true, you will be joining me soon, said Zeta-28 as she reached into a hatch on her body and removed Sig's mirrored key. I will be using the same procedure on you, and this marvelous shield of yours will protect me, and the Master, of course. Sig clenched his fists and began pacing back and forth. Zeta-28 seemed pleased with his reaction and stowed the key within the hatch on the tread mechanism into which her spine was fused. In case you are curious, added Zeta-28, you will be able to see how effective the procedure will be on your augmented friend. Sig tried to hide his anger, but he caught himself clenching his fists and grinding his teeth. Enduring the torture of the fire demon worshippers was one thing. He could handle physical pain. Seeing his friends brutalized and being unable to do anything was quite another. He managed to laugh and smile his way through repeated brands searing the flesh on his back, but he found himself fuming as he watched Zeta-28 stick additional tubes and wires into Row 82 on the examination table. The thought that Stephanie Mason might be strapped to a similar table and that she might also have been reduced to a persistent vegetative state was nearly more than Sig could bear. He had not planned on this. Zeta-28 represented everything cold and harsh about their world. He longed to change it. He longed to redeem it. When they learned that Jennifer Cedar was the bearer of the time key and had power to transport them back to before the world had been ruined, he had been so confident. They had never expected that going back in time had always been their fate, though, and that Dr. Daniel Young, who had been given the healing power of the Heaven's Breath Key, ended up using human sacrifices to become a monstrosity of tremendous power known as the Destroyer, or Abaddon. After Daniel's betrayal, Victor Lee had taken up the Heaven's Breath Key and helped Sig reclaim the Heaven's Shield Key. Along with Jonathan Knight, the Soul Key Bearer, and Kirana Sepharvaim, the Heaven's Sword Key Bearer, they had been able to prevent the Destroyer from reviving the Archdemon. Unfortunately, in the process of stopping Abaddon, a tremendous amount of energy had been released that sliced the moon in half and threw the spin of the Earth so that one side almost always faced the sun and the other side almost always faced away from the sun, creating a ruined world where only a narrow band around the equator was even habitable at all. They had ultimately been responsible for the destruction that they had hoped to repair. Eventually, a new plan to stop the destruction had been created. They again returned back in time and killed Daniel Young before he became the Destroyer. Sig's hopes had been so high when the traitorous Daniel Young had been stopped. Instead, though, they had been thrown to a future where things seemed very much the way they had been all along. Additionally, their attempt to change time had thrown everyone but the Time Key Bearer back to their own time. He recalled when he had first been pulled again to the future. He had appeared alone in a large crater. Eventually, he found his way to a settlement, but was emotionally crushed when he learned that humanity had been relegated to the same awful fate. People had assumed that he was insane when he questioned them. They confirmed that the Destroyer had mysteriously appeared, cut the moon, created the hot and cold zones, and then vanished. He hoped that he could track down his friends, but found no trace of them anywhere. He wondered if they had been sent to the cold zone to freeze or the hot zone to wither, and if he had been the only one that managed to make it into the habitable zone. Several months later, he ran into Row 82, though. Row 82 seemed just as bewildered as Sig had been. Sig had quickly learned that the augment had just arrived. They realized that they were being pulled forward to slightly different times. Several months later, Lizard, Victor, Stephanie, Jonathan, and Kirana appeared. It took about a year before Lucas showed up, but finally they were all reunited, except for Jennifer Cedar. Victor had set up a camp and created a temporary hospital to use his divine key to help others while staying close to the area he had first appeared. He was convinced that Jennifer was coming and that it was his job to wait for her. The others had determined to take up the old jobs of fighting augments and demon worshippers. For the past year, that seemed to be enough. Sig had become content that his ambition to redeem the world was best served by doing the best he could in his own time, instead of trying to change history. He found great satisfaction in freeing slaves and saving the lives of those who demon worshippers were anxious to sacrifice in exchange for their power. Eventually, the feelings of despair he had felt when he was thrown into his own time after killing Daniel Young waned away. Only occasionally would the sight of the moon chunks in the sky stir up the sensation of regret and the questions of what he might have done differently to avoid this fate. Over this year, Stephanie began to withdraw from the others. Sig had tried to reach out to her and help her, and Lucas had improved her interface for speaking, so it was almost natural. But when Jonathan and Kirana had married, something inside her had snapped. She had told Sig not to follow her, and had warned Lizard and Row 82 not to tell anyone else where she was. Sig had been disappointed, but had respected her wishes. The previous 6 months had gone by much as Sig had expected. They had gained a reputation among the augments, and they had as many defensive tasks as they had requests for help from struggling slaves. Of course, having the impenetrable heavenly shield had helped in this task. Not long before Sig found himself in Zeta-28's captivity, Lizard and Rho-82 had reported activities deep in the cold zone. There were small armies of genetically augmented soldiers that were incredibly fast, strong, and intelligent. In the process of investigating, Rho-82 had discovered that Stephanie was being held in a frozen compound far in the south. The team had seriously underestimated the abilities of those that guarded the facility. It had been as though they could predict their movements. One of the super soldiers had swiped Sig's divine key before he could activate it. Now he found himself imprisoned by Zeta-28. He paced back and forth as he remembered Stephanie's face. He imagined it had been altered by tubes and wires and drained of any emotion. He had kept his cool after having seen slaves murdered, children butchered, families split, women attacked, property destroyed, and a number of other horrors that might have broken other men. But the thought of Zeta-28 hurting Stephanie Mason made his blood boil. He was distracted as Rho-82 began speaking in a cold, robotic tone. "The perimeter of this structure is being approached by divine key bearers," said Rho-82. "Curious," said Zeta-28. "Why have we not heard from Stephanie on this matter?" Zeta-28 rolled out of the room. Sig threw himself against the force field out of frustration, but the field threw him back with a loud zap. "Calm down, Sig," said Rho-82. Sig leapt to his feet. "What?" he said in confusion. There was not a reason Sig could imagine why Rho-82 would speak to him in his current state. "Everything will be okay," said Rho-82. The voice was cold and emotionless. Even if Rho-82 had been in possession of his faculties, he still never would have believed that the augment would have attempted to comfort him. "Rho-82?" asked Sig, hoping for some more clarification. "He will be fine too," said Rho-82. Sig scratched his head as he tried to make sense of the situation. "Who are you?" said Sig at last. "Who do you know that speaks through machines?" asked Rho-82. Sig's eyes grew wide as he remembered how Stephanie had been mute and that she had used text-to-speech programs in order to have a voice. "Stephanie?" said Sig in disbelief. "Yes," said Rho-82. Sig smiled widely for the first time since Stephanie disappeared. "How are you doing this?" said Sig. "I can see the future, you know," said Rho-82, "and I couldn't keep the truth from Rho-82. He actually helped come up with this. We tweaked the voice box augmentations so that this message could be delivered." "What do I do now?" asked Sig. "Stand back," said Rho-82. Sig stood back, but nothing happened. "Stephanie?" whispered Sig. There was no response. "Stephanie?" said Sig louder. There was still no response. "Stephanie!" shouted Sig. Suddenly 3 colossal super soldiers rushed into the room and began making adjustments to the examination table. "Get away from him!" shouted Sig angrily. The super soldiers ignored Sig and continued adjusting the table. Suddenly there was an explosion below the table. Tubes and wires flung outward. The force field in Sig's cell immediately went down, and shrapnel flew at Sig. He ignored the pieces of plastic and wire that stuck into his arms and rushed out of the room. The explosion had killed the super soldiers, but Rho-82 appeared to have been protected by the table to which he had been strapped. "Rho-82? Stephanie?" shouted Sig. There was no response. Sig followed his instincts and ripped the extra tubes and wires out of Rho-82's body. He slung the augment over his shoulder and rushed to the shadows on the other side of the room. He pressed his ear against the wall to see if he could get a sense of what might be happening on the other side, but as soon as he did, the sound of gunfire erupted. Sig crouched down in the hopes that he would avoid taking fire as he positioned himself between the sound of the gunfire and Rho-82. The amount of gunfire reduced itself as a familiar 12-gauge shotgun fired, pumped, and fired again. "Lucas," whispered Sig with a smile. A moment later, Victor rushed into the door and looked around. His long dark coat seemed to float behind him as he checked the room. "Victor?" "Victor," said Sig with a smile. Victor whirled around, pointing his pistol, but put his weapon down as he recognized Sig. "Sig," said Victor. "Am I glad to see you?" said Sig. Victor rushed over as he pulled the mirrored key out from under his coat. "Row 82 first," said Sig. Victor nodded and placed his hands on Row 82's head. Gunfire echoed in the halls as Row 82 began coughing and regained consciousness. The wounds from the tubes and wires that had been woven into his flesh had been healed. "Row 82?" said Sig. Slowly the augment blinked his eyes and got to his feet. He looked around for a moment. "We are in one of Zeta 28's facilities," said Row 82. "Has Stephanie used my voice to speak to you?" "Yes," said Sig. Victor placed his hands on Sig's head. Sig winced in pain as pieces of wire and plastic squeezed through his skin. "Where is Stephanie?" asked Row 82. "I was going to ask you the same question," said Sig. Row 82 shrieked loudly and listened. A moment later, he motioned for the others to follow him. "It looks like Lucas is already on his way there," said Row 82. The three of them rushed out of the room. The halls were lined with plastic tubes and wires. Some of them seemed to slither, but Row 82 did not seem concerned, so Sig and Victor followed after him. Eventually, they came to a large chamber where Zeta 28 was set next to a feeble man in a wheelchair. It took a moment, but Victor and Sig finally recognized him as William Fine, a demon lord that had power to control the minds of others. Lucas, Jonathan, and Kirana were there, but the thing that caught Sig's eye was a pod with a glass cover that held Stephanie Mason. "Stephanie," whispered Sig angrily. "You have all arrived," said Zeta 28. Lucas looked back and took note that Victor had helped Sig and Row 82. He turned his attention back to Zeta 28. "Release Stephanie Mason at once," shouted Sig angrily. "I think not," said Zeta 28. "I have calculated that William Fine's abilities will likely take control of each of you." Lizard suddenly teleported next to Zeta 28 and looked at the others. He had a glazed look on his face that indicated he was not in control of his faculties. "That seems wise," said Lucas. "It is," said Zeta 28. "Except that we have someone with greater mind control power than William Fine," said Lucas. "Who?" asked Zeta 28 with genuine curiosity. "My husband," said Kirana. Jonathan's eyes began glowing brightly. Zeta 28 turned to William to verify the authenticity of Kirana's claim. William was twitching in his wheelchair. Zeta 28 frowned. "This was an uncalculated outcome," she said. Lizard suddenly teleported in front of her and ripped open the hatch on her body that contained Sig's heavenly shield key. He teleported next to Sig and returned it to him. Kirana rushed toward Stephanie's pod. "You have beaten me for now," conceded Zeta 28. "She beat you," said Lucas. "She predicted this outcome. She knew what would happen." "Your victory is only temporary," said Zeta 28 as Kirana ripped open the pod and Sig pulled Stephanie out. "She knew that too," whispered Lucas with a frown. Stephanie winced as she gained consciousness under Victor's healing powers. "Let's go," shouted Lucas. "Why aren't we staying to finish them off?" asked Kirana with a frown. Row 82 gasped. "Jennifer Cedar," he said. "After all these years." Victor's eyes grew wide. "What?" he exclaimed. "She's finally arrived," said Row 82. "But she's dying."